Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar about the RISE Education Systems Diagnostic, a set of tools to select strategic priorities for education systems reform. My name is Yue-Yi. I'm the research manager at the Research on Improving Systems of Education program, or RISE, and I'm so delighted that you're joining us for this webinar today. Next slide, please. This webinar coincides with the launch of the RISE Education Systems Diagnostic Toolkit, which can be downloaded here, and my colleagues will also be putting the link in the chat. So the RISE Education Systems Diagnostic is a set of tools for selecting high-level strategic priorities for education systems reform, and also for building consensus around those priorities. You'll be hearing a lot more about the diagnostic over the next 90 minutes, but first I just wanted to give you a quick preview of this toolkit. Next slide, please. So as you can see, the toolkit is made up of 8 sections in 3 parts, and all of these support different phases of the diagnostic, which you'll be hearing about later. And in the toolkit, there are write-ups about different use cases for the diagnostic and about understanding it and applying it. Next slide. But besides these write-ups, there's also, for example, a set of editable tools to support planning and analysis. And next slide. We also have a training video. And next. There's also a bank of example materials from the 6 wonderful teams that piloted the diagnostic in 2022. And you'll be hearing from representatives of each of those 2 teams later in the webinar. And I see some chatting in the Zoom chat already. So just to give you a quick overview of what will be happening today. Next slide. So, could you go next? I think I got that in the wrong order. There we go. So we'll be starting with 3 short presentations, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion after that. And throughout this webinar, we're going to be taking questions through the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you're also welcome to use the chat function, as I see some people are already doing, which is exciting, just to share reflections, reactions with the rest of the audience. But if you have a question that you'd like the speakers to address live, please make sure you submit it through the Q&A function. So I'm going to introduce the roundtable speakers later, but just for the presentations to start with, we're going to start with a presentation from Jason Silberstein, my colleague at the RISE Directorate, who'll be giving an overview of the diagnostic. Then we're going to hear from 2 of the teams that piloted the diagnostic last year. So first from Dante Castillo, who's at SUMMA, which is a Latin American education research laboratory. SUMMA is based in Chile, and their diagnostic pilot was in Ecuador. Then we're going to hear from Rafiullah Kakar, who's at the Planning Commission of Pakistan. And Rafi was part of one of the teams that piloted the diagnostic in the Balochistan province of Pakistan. Right, and I'm very excited about these presentations. I'm not going to keep going on. Jason, it's over to you. Whenever you're ready, you can start your presentation.
Great, thanks, Yue-Yi. Can you see that okay? Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Silberstein. I'm a research fellow. I'm a research fellow with RISE. And I was involved in the first pilot of the RISE diagnostic back in 2019, and since then have been part of the team helping to iterate and improve the tool. And so my goal today is just to give you a basic background on the diagnostic to kind of tee up the presentations from our pilot teams about their findings. And so to do that, I'm going to talk about the diagnostic's purpose, the process to implement it, and the framework or the method behind it. Okay, so what is this tool good for? Well, first, it lets you apply systems thinking to understand different kinds of misalignment in the education system, meaning are the parts of the system aligned to deliver learning or not, and are the parts of the system aligned with each other or not. Second, the tool helps you prioritize from among those different misalignments and select 1 or 2 where you can take action. And then third, the diagnostic helps build this common understanding of what's holding the system back from improving learning and what to do about it, both the output and the process of doing the diagnostic. So in other words, the diagnostic is explicitly not meant to result in an out-of-the-box kind of intervention that you can implement. It's a tool for high-level strategy that's kind of most useful at a moment when a government or an organization wants insight into the systemic or the structural things that are holding them back from improving learning. So a little over a year ago, RISE put out a call for proposals and was really lucky to find 6 organizations who were in exactly that kind of moment of high-level strategic thinking about improving learning. And all of those 6 pilots are listed here, and members of those teams are with us today. Everyone except the Ghana pilot, which was an older pilot pre-COVID. And so I'm just going to point out a few things quickly from this table. If you look at column 3, the pilots were done by multiple different kinds of implementers who all found that the diagnostic purpose fit their needs. If you look at column 4, most of the pilots have involved strong partnerships with government at different levels. And then if you look at the last column, a few different use cases have fit the diagnostic purpose so far. So the most common use case has been to help government think about forward-looking policy priorities to improve learning. But another use case has been to review past programs in the context of the wider system to kind of try and understand why did that program have or not have an impact on learning. And then another use case has actually been to inform program design. So thinking about how a new program might fit into the wider system. Okay, so that gives you a sense of the diagnostic's intended purpose. Let me give you a sense of what doing the diagnostic actually looks like. So this is a 6-step process that was generally followed by all of the pilots with adaptations. So step 1 is an inception phase, which is about finding the right team, finding the right audience for the diagnostics findings. So that's often been a government-led steering committee. Step 2 is a desk review, where the goal is using existing knowledge within the team and reviewing some documents to arrive at the early hypotheses about those misalignments in the system. Step 3 is workshops. So there's mostly it's workshop-based qualitative data collection with small groups of stakeholders who have complementary perspectives on specific parts of the system, and usually lots of workshops are held to kind of zoom in on different functions and different levels of the system in turn. Step 4 is analysis, which involves building a narrative description of the system that is focused around the different misalignments that were uncovered from the desk review and the workshops. Step 5, prioritization, which is where the diagnostic teams bring that menu of misalignments often to their steering committee and agree on which 1 or 2 have the greatest margin for action. And then step 6 is a final written output of 10 or 15 pages focused on the prioritized misalignment and why addressing it might help push the system to improve learning outcomes. So the full process was just about doable for the pilot teams in around 6 months. Okay, that's the process. Now, let me briefly touch on the actual framework that this process uses to analyze the system. So before I dive in, a quick reminder why we need a systems framework in the first place. So consider this analogy from health. If someone is sick, it's tempting to just treat each symptom of their illness, right? So if someone has a fever, cool them down. But we all know that won't actually cure them, right? To cure them, we need to diagnose what is the underlying illness. And so similarly in education, it's tempting to treat the very visible symptoms of the learning crisis. If there's no textbooks, give children more textbooks. But many projects fail precisely because they only address one part of the system at a time, and they don't have a theory of how all those parts fit together and jointly focus on learning or not. So the magic thing about the RISE framework is that it offers a systematic way to analyze how all the parts fit together in almost any education system. And the framework starts from describing 4 main relationships that you see here. There's politics, the relationship between citizens and the state. There's compact, the relationship between the state and line ministries in charge of education. There's management, which is between the Ministry of Education and schools. And then there's voice and choice, which is between families and schools. Then the framework offers 5 components that shape each of those relationships. So you can think of these as kind of system levers that you can pull to change or shape each of those relationships. The first lever is delegation. What's the main educational goal pursued by the relationship? The second is finance. What are the resources provided to achieve the goal? Third is support. What is the help or training to achieve the goal? Fourth is information. How is progress towards the goal measured? And lastly, motivation. How is meeting the goal or not meeting the goal incentivized? And then finally, each of those relationships and each of the system levers that structure the relationships can be aligned for many different things, right? They can be aligned to produce learning. They could be aligned to maximize access to schooling. They could be aligned for other educational or non-educational outcomes. And so some of the tools in the diagnostic toolkit offer a very detailed description of what does each relationship and each of those system levers look like under all of these different common alignments in education systems.
Jason, 2 minutes left.
Okay, perfect. Okay, last slide, actually. Putting all this together, you get a kind of method to describe the overall system and recognize the misalignments that I keep talking about between its different parts. So the gears here are illustrating one very simple example. The green gear at the top is aligned for learning. The diagnostic team, in this simple example, found that the ministry in this system expects teachers to prioritize foundational literacy. So that's a sensible learning aligned goal for many systems. The green gear in the middle is also aligned for learning. So the diagnostic team found that the bureaucracy is making sure teachers get lots of support around towards that learning goal. However, when the diagnostic team in this made-up example looked at the assessments in this system, they only happened at the end of secondary school, and they were mainly used to select the best students for placement in university. So the yellow information gear in this system is not aligned for learning. And there's a misalignment between the goals and support offered to teachers on the one hand, and the information that's kind of used to evaluate teachers on the other hand. So the diagnostic is highlighting how these misalignments are pulling teachers in different directions and maybe preventing them from focusing on learning. Okay, that's very high level flavor for the method, but that's all I have time for. So everything I just touched on is covered in exhaustive detail in the different tools in the toolkit, but hopefully that's enough background to give you some context for the pilot results. Thanks so much, and back to you, Yue-Yi.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jason, for that great overview of the diagnostic. We're going to shift right now to presentations from 2 people who actually were involved in piloting this diagnostic, so you can see what it looks like in practice. But before that, I know people were trickling in at the start. So just for anyone who missed it, this webinar today is coinciding with the launch of the RISE Education Systems Diagnostic Toolkit. My colleagues will put the link to that in the chat. I encourage you to check it out, use it, share it far and wide. Also, just a housekeeping reminder, you are more than welcome to use the chat to share thoughts, reactions to others in the audience as the webinar progresses. We're also taking questions. If you have a question that you'd like the speakers to address live, just use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll take those as we go along. And now I'm going to pass it over to Dante Castillo from SUMMA, who's going to tell us about the diagnostic pilot that his team ran in Ecuador. Thank you so much, Dante. Dante, you're on mute.
Thank you, Yue-Yi, and thank you, Jay. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this webinar, and actually for being part of the diagnostic exercise we run in Ecuador. Just a few things about SUMMA. I am part of the SUMMA research team, and we were a team of 4 people with working with Javier Gonzalez, which is the director of SUMMA, Montserrat Kremer, Magali Ramos, and myself, working on this kind of wonderful project in Ecuador. A lot of learning we had during this experience. So I want to share some general ideas about what we did in Ecuador and how we put in practice this tool. As Jason said, it's a very complex. It's simple, but it's complex to do this in practice when you are working with ministries and real key actors and stakeholders. So the first things is we're kind of a research and innovation laboratory in education for Latin America, and we have a very close relationships with ministries of education. And this study and this pilot was really interesting, because part of the team was Montserrat and Magali. They were former, Montserrat, Minister of Education, and Magali was kind of director of the Teacher Professional Development Office in Ecuador. So our team had a really interesting perspective, discussing from inside of the ministry, but also our role as an external researchers working with these 2 great colleagues. This project was interesting as well because we had a really interesting advisory committee, which was formed by key stakeholders in Ecuador. The very Minister of Education, or a representative of her, was taking part in our meetings. We had also involved and very engaged the director of the National Quality Assessment Office, representatives of Teachers Union, researcher, international organizations. So we had a really critical but friendly, advisory group. And the idea, basically, what I can say in terms of, the original idea of this project and this effort was to try to understand why, Ecuador, despite of the many efforts they were doing and some kind of increasing in learning improvement in the last, 2026 and 2013, the improvement in learning was kind of face and standstill. It's kind of standstill, and they were not progressing very much in the last years. So basically, that was the idea, and we tried to understand why using this, why was the reason of that, and we thought that the RISE framework was a really nice tool to collect information to do that. Just in terms of the methodology in action, we frame with the stakeholders. We frame this as an exploratory and participatory study, to identify critical misalignment in the Ecuadorian system. We try to be very loyal to the diagnostic, running all the steps that Jason mentioned, from the first formation of the advisory committee to the dissemination, going through all the process of the desk review, collecting data, identifying those kind of key challenges, and why the Ecuadorian system was facing, and is facing, actually, it's not was facing, is facing today. We were with invited 47 participants to the 3 workshops we ran in a period of 1 month. So it was very intensive in terms of data collection and analysis, plus 6 semi-structured interviews. We work in 3 cities in Quito, which is the capital city of Ecuador, and also represent the central government. That was the rationale to work in Quito. We also ran a workshop in Tena, which is in the Amazon region, and a lot of local actors, very kind of grassroots organizations took part in that workshop, but also in Guayaquil, which is a Pacific coast region, and with different levels of district level and of the administration of the ministry. So we try to have a nice and balanced representation of the different realities of the system. Probably I have to say some kind of for those who are thinking to run this tool, it isn't. I think it's worth to mention that it's in a way puts a new lens of, and you have to share what our experience we share with the stakeholders, how this new lens, the 5+by4 matrix works, and a lot of, as I said, a lot of intensive process of data collection and analysis. And probably the topics, the levels in which we were trying to conduct this was also quite, challenging and intensive, because we basically we focus and try to connect, all the compact relationship with the management, relationship. And, it's not very easy for the stakeholders to talk and to analyze in that kind of system perspective. So requires a lot of conversation, explanation of why and how we are producing that, that level. That is in terms of the, kind of the methodology we put in place. Just to mention, we ran a survey with all the 47 participants in different, they had to assess all the relationships and elements, and in general, I would say the general perception of this project is there is a kind of clear, I would say, clear orientation or alignment to compliance in Ecuador. It is that is something very clear, and all the actors and stakeholders we interview recognizes, all of them did recognize that compliance is a key issue. How that kind of administrative task, a lot of process of providing information to the ministry, kind of preventing them from, more kind of putting focus on learning, and I think that was it's a critical issue. But also,
2 minutes left.
Okay, that's fine. Tendencies to patronage and clientelism was also very, very critical. Just to mention 4, priority areas for alignment identified in Ecuador. I would say the first one is in terms of resources, in terms of the compact relationship, insufficient public spending, that is critical. The fundamental law, the constitution, said that Ecuador has to offer or to define 6% of the GDP in terms of, but the level is below 4%. So it's super necessary to connect and meet in terms of the finance what the law says, reaching that 6%, which is put a lot of pressure to the system. And I think in terms of the delegation of what the higher authorities command to the Ministry of Education, put it in a big pressure to do and to conduct all the activities they have to run. The second point and priority area we identify is how we can align central and local management structure towards pedagogical improvement. This is a key area, and we thought everyone in the administrative change feels that what the role for them is basically to follow orders. One teacher at some point said, "What is it?" When we asked, "What is the role of the school today? And that teacher said to follow orders, in order to fill forms, and to provide information to the ministry, but they don't know many times, or that is the perception, that is no value, has no value for, the pedagogical task. So the third point we identify is critical, the lack of the support to have a supportive relationship. One minute, Yue-Yi, supportive relationship with the ministry to the schools. And finally, to the idea of contextualization, curriculum or evaluation or assessment is critical to be adapted to the local need. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dante. As you can see, the diagnostic can throw up so many insights that it's hard to summarize them when the teams are keen to talk. And we're going to go to another continent now. So from Ecuador all the way over to the province of Balochistan in Pakistan. And for this, we're going to hear from Rafiullah Kakar, who's at the Planning Commission of Pakistan. All yours, Rafi.
Thank you, Yue-Yi. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. First of all, let me make sure that the presentation is on the screen. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn on the stopwatch as well. So, okay. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and opportunity for me to present the takeaways from the pilot study that our team conducted. On behalf of the team, I am grateful to the RISE team for giving us this opportunity. So here is a quick introduction of the team. There were two teams, Verso and Juniper Policy Consulting. They collaborated for this study. The core team was based in the province of Balochistan in Quetta. The senior team members had been working in education sector for over a decade, and the team lead, Sami Saab, he has been working for well over 2 decades in education sector. Myself and few other colleagues have been working in education sector, and some of us were part of the team that developed the 2 education sector plans for the province of Balochistan. So we were quite well versed and familiar with the education terrain and landscape before we started this initiative. The government counterparts included the Strategic Planning and Reform Cell. It was a small cell based in the Planning and Development Department, and it was responsible for providing policy advice and guidance to the government of Balochistan on a number of policy areas, including education. And a number of former secretaries and senior bureaucrats who have served in the school education department for a good number of years and have built themselves a reputation of being education champions. So they were also engaged throughout this exercise, mainly through the forum of the steering committee. Just to provide a quick background, so Balochistan is one of the most fragile and underdeveloped and poorest provinces of Pakistan. In 2010, the 18th constitutional amendment was adopted, which basically devolved responsibility for education provision to the provinces. What we have seen since 2010 is that we have seen an increased prioritization of education, which has been demonstrated in increased financing for education and reforms in education management, as well as the data regime for education. However, the increased financing and the reforms have not translated into improvements in schooling and learning outcomes. So even the excess outcomes have remained largely stagnant. So our team used this RISE diagnostic tool to retrospectively diagnose as to why these policy reforms and increased investments did not translate into improvement in access and learning outcomes. We focused on the period from 2013 to 2018, and we focused on a set of initiatives that focused mainly on whose stated goal was the expansion of schooling opportunities. So around 2,500 to 3,000 new schools were built during this period. New data management regime in the form of real-time school monitoring system was introduced. Merit-based recruitment policy for teachers was introduced. So these three set of reforms cumulatively were supposed to improve access to schooling and result in a decrease in the number of out-of-school children, but that didn't happen. So we tried to investigate as to why it didn't translate. So here is the process. We started with desk research. We adapted the RISE methodology and played with it given the context and tailored it to the context as well as the strengths and limitations of our own team. Given the fact that we had some people on the team who were very familiar with the education landscape and had been involved in designing education policies and reforms for the past 15 years. We took advantage of that. So we started with an internal simulation exercise. It involved over a dozen of sessions stretched over the course of 1 month, whereby we went through each and every cell of the template and tried to fill it based on whatever knowledge and information we had without conducting any field work. So once we did it, it was very useful. It not only identified missing information and gaps, but it also helped us review and rethink some of our previously held assumptions about education delivery in the province. So then the key informant interviews were quite targeted in nature. In the steering committee, we didn't include the political tier because we wanted the people to sort of speak to speak openly. So we targeted the political tier in the key informant interviews, and then we had stakeholder workshop. But then we went to the district tier where we held focus group discussions. 3 focus group discussions were held. Again, one final round of key informant interviews to sort of gather missing information, and then we held another round of internal simulation, and we sort of revisited the template that was filled. So the key findings for us. So the first major finding was that the school education system is well aligned, but the issue is that it is neither aligned around access nor learning. It was aligned around patronage. 3 out of the 4 relationships of the RISE diagnostic framework had a dominant alignment around patronage and weak alignment around access. And the key feature for us was that there was a major difference between the de jure and de facto, the de jure goals and the de facto practice of the education department as well as the highest state executives. So while the system was aligned for patronage across 4 relationships, there were major misalignments within these relationships. And this was driven mainly by the difference between the de jure and de facto, the de jure goals, stated goals, and the de facto practice. So there were times where improving access was the stated goal and even finances were allocated, but then these finances were spent in a way to reward clientelistic networks and patronage networks rather than addressing the needs of out-of-school children. Similarly, necessary financing for provision of human resource was not made available. So I'll share these with few concrete examples. So this
Rafi,
is
just over 2 minutes left. Okay.
In the compact relationship, there was partial incoherence between delegation and finance. So what did it mean was that while reduction of out-of-school children was the stated goal, and yes, significant budget was allocated for construction of new schools, but financing was not made available for hiring of HR once these schools got completed. So here a partial misalignment between delegation and finance. The other interesting part was that data consistently highlighted that the number of non-functional schools are increasing because schools buildings are built, but HR is not being made available. Now, and there was this data regime which showed this picture, but the principal, the highest state authorities were not interested in this information, and they kept on building new schools without making an effort to make the existing schools functional, despite the availability of data. Similarly, within management, so first, the interesting thing, the interesting consequence of a merit-based recruitment policy for teachers was that teacher hiring got slow because the principal could no longer manipulate it to reward their patronage networks. As a result, many 8,000 to 9,000 vacancies, teacher vacancies remained unfilled. And in occasions where teachers were hired, they were assigned and posted based on patronage-driven considerations rather than where these teachers were needed. As a result, most of the rural areas were left deprived of the necessary HR that they needed. So again, the non-availability of teachers is something that has come up repeatedly in even the input-centric data regime. Again, the principal was not interested in using this data. As a result, they neither tried to rationalize the teacher transfer posting policy, nor made a serious effort to fill the vacancies. And whenever some effort was made by a senior bureaucrat, the political tier sort of overshadowed or trumped that effort. So with this, I will conclude, and I think these three examples were enough to demonstrate the findings of this tool. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thanks, Rafi. That was a wonderful demonstration. So I'm just going to float a question each for Dante and then for Rafi. I'm sorry, Rafi, could you take yours? Perfect. And then there are also other questions in the chat. Jason, can I signal to you to answer the one from Radhika about contextualizing the diagnostic to large schools or chains of schools? And then there's another question in there about practicalities, and I'll encourage Dante, Rafi, and Jason to all go in and deal with that later. But first, question for Dante from Parthsha about what explains the lack of supportive relationships between the ministry and schools in the Ecuador pilot. And while you're answering that, Rafi, if you could think about the question from Imran Ali Abro about how are the tools contextualized for the Balochistan context? I think based on what RISE gave you, how did you adapt that for your setting? So Rafi, Dante, have about 2 or 3 minutes each, and then.
Rafi, do you? Okay, I can start, Rafi. Okay, okay. I think it's a great question. Probably when we analyze the data and what the participants express in all the workshops, the idea was we put it in at some point that schools, teachers, and principals there is a feeling of loneliness in terms of what they do at the at the local level, and I think we can interpret that kind of relationship as a lack of supportive relationship. There is a lot of one way demand in order for the ministry to say to the school and teachers, you have to do this, you have to do that. But in terms of the feedback to the ministry, probably what there is no kind of conversation in terms of what teachers demands and they need. For example, just one example. Teachers are expected to provide lessons, but they don't have kind of non-teaching hours to prepare the lesson, to provide feedback. So there is a kind of a system in which there is a huge demand, but to fill, as I said, to fill, forms, to provide information to the ministry, but in exchange they have kind of very little. That is why we put in the report and in the study that kind of the need to to address that kind of support from the ministry to the school.
Great, thanks, Dante. I think unfortunately that's a misalignment that we see in many education systems. I experienced it myself when I was a teacher in Malaysia. But Rafi, all yours, a couple minutes about how that's also contextualized.
Thank you. I'll take the liberty of responding to 3 very important questions in 2 minutes. So Catherine and Santiago have asked very relevant questions that are pertinent to Balochistan. And Imran's questions, as I explained in the presentation, we did take the liberty of adapting the RISE tool to the local context. And we were in this position because we were somehow familiar with this tool we had used a more raw version of this tool in the form of the World Bank's accountability triangle in the preparation of the Balochistan education sector plan. And we adapted it in terms of the methodology. Many government officers were not available. Even if they indicated commitment to attend a meeting, they would not show up. So we improvised and we went for key informant interviews with them. Similarly, we purposefully excluded the political tier from steering committee and others because of the heavy expected alignment around patronage. We wanted other stakeholders to openly express their views. Santiago has asked a question about, very good question about changes over time in patronage. And was it all top down or a bottom up? Yes, patronage did change over time. So there was this period for these 5 years, the first 2 years, the ruling coalition was more aligned, was genuinely aligned towards access. But after the 2 years, the last 2 years, there was a change of government because the chief minister was a commoner from middle class. When he got changed, the other chief minister was from these traditional elite parties. So he didn't give the same level of prioritization to education. And the result was that patronage became very dominant. Catherine has asked a question about its impact in fragile contexts. So Balochistan is also a conflict zone. And we also try to analyze the politics relationship in this template. One of the most important findings for us was how the issues around conflict and right to life crowded out issues around education delivery in fragile and conflict affected contexts. So on the demand side, in the politics relationship, in the agenda setting and prioritization of key issues, so education service delivery was competing with issues around right to life. As a result, naturally, education delivery was not among the top priority issues in public discourse because that space was taken up by issues around conflict, which had a very negative impact on other relationships as well, as neither civil society nor political parties were asking tough and right questions about education delivery.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rafi. That's 3 questions in 3 minutes, which I'm impressed by. Audience, feel free to keep feeding questions into the Q&A. Rafi, Dante, and Jason will stay on throughout the rest of the webinar and can answer questions by text there. But we're going to move on. Also, I see some questions going into the chat, but again, if you do want the panelists to answer them, do put them straight in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're moving on to the roundtable now, and we will be drawing on some questions from the Q&A function for that as well. I'm just going to really quickly introduce the roundtable speakers. So Rafi and Dante were from 2 of the 6 teams that piloted the diagnostic last year. So we're going to hear from the other 4 teams now. And on the roundtable, we have Prathajit Das from the Central Square Foundation in India. We have Linda Nakato from the Economic Policy Research Center in Uganda. We have Gautam Anand from Global School Leaders, which works across a number of partner countries, and Bram Fleisch from Wits University in South Africa. And the conversation between the 4 of them will be chaired by the wonderful Louise Crouch, who is from RTI International and a member of the RISE Research Directorate. So Louise, all yours now.
Okay. I'm sure most of the audience wants to hear directly from the presenters. So I'm not going to say anything more. And I'm going to go right to the presenters. And guys, the way you show up on my screen, maybe that's the way we should order things, unless I can't remember whether there's a prescribed order in the agenda. But why don't we do it in this order? Prathajit first, then Linda, then Gautam, then Bram, because that's just the way you happen to appear on my screen. Let's do it that way, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So,
Thanks, Luis.
And as a reminder, you have 6 minutes each, I think is what I had said.
Great,
so
Luis.
Go for it.
No, thanks, Luis. And I think I'll start by making a few opening remarks about the toolkit and the framework itself and what it allows us to do. And we'll probably start with a very small story about in the Indian spiritual tradition, where 5 men were asked to get into a dark room to actually, understand what an elephant is and come out and describe to their master or guru what the elephant is. So as you can imagine, as people came out and the guru said, so what did you feel in this dark room? What is an elephant? somebody who touched the trunk or the legs of the elephant said, we've seen it's like a tree trunk. People who caught hold of the tail say it's like a serpent. People who were close to the body say it's like a wall. So you can imagine, right? And I think the framework is the breadth is really, really comprehensive. And I think the details, the depth actually makes it very, very detailed. So what I'm trying to say, it's a very, very comprehensive framework to understand the system as a whole, right? And this framework literally puts the light on in that room so that you can understand the beast, that's the elephant, as a whole. And that's so true of large education systems. The sum is really, the whole is really, greater than the sum of the parts. And I think what happens is, our systems, education systems, have arranged themselves around these specializations, what this framework calls as elements, whether it was finance, delegation, and, let's say funding, the academic part, and all of this. And that's how even people who work with the system, including, let's say, NGOs and consultancies, we work on these specializations, or let's say if you choose to call it subsystems, or, what the government would understand as departments and, teams. And that's so easy, but, and that's easy to also analyze problems in that way and try to solve for it. Okay, seems like an academic problem. Can I solve it? And people have been trying and not realizing, look, ultimately things are not happening. We are pumping more money, but things are not changing. We are doing more things, coming out with new frameworks and newer things to work with, but things are not changing. So that's because, I think the elephant walks and moves around as a whole, and it's not enough to address a particular component or subcomponent, and that's the challenge. But I think that's also the challenge of this framework. Why it does a great job of, let's say, allowing you by the sheer, let's say, comprehensiveness and the thoroughness of the framework to analyze all these things, how they interact with each other, and how each relationship works, and which is and that allows you to do that, all of this, right? As to analyze all of this, bring it together, and really say, what does it mean, and how does it, how do you take further from that? That's the challenge. So I think in our experience, it has been great to diagnose the problems, bring it all together, and that's also a great virtue of a framework or a like this, to come up with things that people also are not necessarily surprised, but I think the articulation makes it sharper, makes it more manageable, and for us to be able to work through it. But I think the challenge also comes to bring the people together, as I said, to prioritize and move towards some action. Those are the elements that I think, as we take this framework and the study findings further in our work in India, I think those are the challenges we want to see, and hopefully we will be able to move through and make progress in terms of prioritizing a few things out of this framework as a process, and as elements to work with as we go along. Luis, so that's my opening remarks. Back to you.
Okay, well, you're actually below the time limit, so thank you very much. Linda, you have 6 minutes.
All right, thank you, Luis, and thank you, Das, and thank you to everyone who is listening in right now, and to the organizers as well. I am Linda, and I'm from the Economic Policy Research Center in Uganda. So we piloted the framework in Uganda, and maybe what is different from the other pilots is that for the case of Uganda, we are piloting the whole framework, right from politics to management to compacts management and voice and choice. So it's like the entire framework. We're not focusing on just one of the relationships. So that even made our elephant bigger and more confusing, if I am to use this as synonym of the elephant. So, and we're specifically focusing on the primary education sector. So what happened is that first of all, that the toolkit really helped us. It guided us to take, take the elephant one piece at a time, and then after that you put it together and you see the elephant beautifully coming out. So what happened is that right from the beginning, even in our paper, in the report, we actually explained the framework. We kept referring back to the framework because that helped us to say, okay, this is the framework and this is what we want to do. So it helps to always look back and also explain it according to your context and with examples from your context. For example, for a case of Uganda, you use really examples that are clear and even sometimes you tweak a bit to just bring out the context of Uganda for that case. So that really helped us in that case. So it was important for us to explain the framework even in the report. So you realize that we have a couple of pages just explaining the framework in simple terms so that when someone gets the report and you're talking about the RISE framework and you're talking about an education systems diagnostic, they're able to go back and look at the framework and then also be able to give you feedback. And I might say it helped us a lot in the validation, the different presentations we made, because we realized that people actually started to even use the words and the synonyms of the framework itself simply because we explained it. And then maybe also to also still mention that we're taking the whole elephant. So it's at some points, of course, it becomes overwhelming when you look at the different steps. If you start at the desk review, we went in because we are a think tank, but then again, you have to be guided by the literature before you design the tool and before you go out there, so that you have the relevant questions. So we went all out when it came to the desk review, and maybe that a little bit became overwhelming, but in the end it helped us, because then when you go to the field and you're interacting with the different stakeholders, you are making sure that they are not feeding, because we all know that the challenges that can come with fieldwork, especially in such, and for us in our context, the political economy of the education sector actually somehow can influence the responses that you get. They might give you politically correct responses, but the desk review helped us in that when we went out there, there's some of these things that we already knew, and we tell them this is what the policy says, but we actually want what the reality on ground is. And it also helps that we are key, like we have been really, the center is key, especially in education, agriculture, generally in policy advisory in Uganda. So it helped us because we had an understanding of how things really happen in policy, but also on ground. And we also went through the same education system. So that desk review really shaped and helped us have clarify the discussions that we had with the participants out there. And then when it came to the steering committee, because this is important, especially to get buy-in for your results, especially in the key different ministries and the policy makers, the policy, the implementers and things like that. For that, I'll also just mention briefly, because of our position in policy advisory in the country, it was quite easy because we've been constantly interacting with these people. And then we also know who is who makes the plans, who are the implementers, who actually, if they front something, it is most likely to be taken up. So we went through the Ministry of Education and Sports, we went to the technical working group, and they were really excited about the framework and the range with the framework that offers, because usually other analyses or other studies are focused on a few areas, but this was looking at the entire system and highlighting what are the key limitations that are hindering us from achieving certain aspects. What are the key, misalignments? So there was buy-in. They were really excited. They looked forward to having the report, and they kept checking in on us. Okay, where are we now? We are waiting for the report as the ministry. And then we also had someone from the Education Policy Review Commission. I might mention that right now Uganda is in the process of revising the white paper that guides the education sector going forward. So that was actually very important. We had someone from that commission, and so that gave us an opening for us to feed into their research and their paper that they will be using. And we hope to even get audience with them. And then of course, when we went for the dissemination, even the people we picked, when we brought the parliamentarian, we said, okay, we need you to come to parliament and explain these things to the education committee, because these are important things and it is evidence-based. And then of course we have the National Planning Authority, Ministry of Finance, because they are keen financing the sector. So generally, when we are picking the steering committee, what I'm trying to say that you have to pay attention. Yes, I'm finishing up. You have to be careful with the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. Gautam, you're next on my screen here. So go ahead, please. You have 6 minutes.
Yeah. Thank you, Luis. So at Global School Leaders, we and our partners are working to strengthen school leaders in LMIC to build meaningful instructional system that can positively influence student outcome. And at the same time, our research efforts are mainly aimed at identifying conditions that can enable successful school leadership. So in this context, I'll first highlight 3 things in terms of how the RISE diagnostic helped us in the process. So first, from a practical perspective, I believe that focusing on one role within the larger education system, for example, school principals or education officers, made the diagnostic framework very useful to us. So in our work, it is very critical to understand the system within which, say, school principals work in the specific context of our programming. And that will help us help them become an effective instructional leader. So it means identifying system level frictions, barriers, any underutilized enabling condition. They're all very important to design our program for them. And also like how school leaders work with the system above, how they work within the school ecosystem, and these can have implications for teaching and learning at the school. So the RISE framework provided us with a great structure to be able to unearth the specific misalignments around principals' work. So like both with the system above and also like within the school. Second thing, our use of the framework in both cases focused mainly on the management relationship. And that means like relationship between education authorities at district, state, national level as like principal, like as in the principal as agent relationship, and the school leaders as agents across the 5 elements of delegation, information, finance, motivation, and support. So it was more of a 5x1 matrix than a 5x4 matrix for us. And I personally believe, since the diagnostic framework is so comprehensive and so detailed and complex, it might be like a tall ask to unpack the misalignments within the system across 4 relationships and 5 design elements in one diagnostic exercise. And often organizations like lack resources or time to do so in one go. So depending on why do we need to understand the system, helped us narrow our focus in a more effective way. So for example, if our aim is to understand how education officers can support teaching and learning at a school, we can start from understanding the management relationships therein and inform our program accordingly. And because of this, like we use the framework to guide our development of like contextualized interview and focus group discussion questions, rather than directly using the areas of inquiry from the framework. And this is not to say that we do not need to focus on other relationships that way, but more about what was the purpose of doing the diagnostic for us right now, and what is the most effective way for us given the resources we have, right? And the third thing in this perspective is also that this framework was not just a diagnostic tool, but also like as a methodological tool. So while it did help in identifying elements of an education system in a specific context, it also offers ways to like study these elements using a variety of methods. So desk review, workshops, in-depth interviews are part of the framework, being like predominantly in-depth qualitative, but we also designed a survey based on what we found from the workshops and the in-depth interviews, so that we can see that if the policy interpretations and issues that we are finding here are also representative at a national level. And taking cue from the framework, we also formed like 2 committees, one steering and one technical, one more for high-level guidance and one more for substantive technical inputs on the study design. So these are the 3 highlights from more like practical utility of the framework. If we like talk about more substantive learning, we found that there's a significant overlap across the 5 dimensions or elements, and possibly that will be true across relationships as well. And they cannot be looked in silos. So one example would be that like the major responsibilities that a school principals have, like one of them would be to like collect a lot of data and report it to the senior levels in the system. But the existing policies do not have a like clear framework on how to use that data to be shared back with the principals or calibrate expectations from them, or how to like think about how the system can support principals in achieving those expectations. So clearly the elements of delegation, information, and support are quite interlinked in this situation. The framework like does allow us to like explore these overlaps, but I'm not sure like if these needs
you're at time. Go time.
very explicit in the framework itself. Yeah. So that's my opening remarks. Thank you, Luis.
Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Ram, you're on next, and you have 6 minutes.
Thanks, Luis, and thanks very much for giving us this opportunity. I'm going to focus primarily on kind of the findings, but just to introduce it by reflecting back on when we started working. I was working with sector-wide analysis. So when we went to IIP, and there was a description of trying to develop large-scale databases. And what's interesting about the 5x4 is it's shifted the focus away from a very heavy emphasis on understanding the analytics of our system, looking at large-scale data sets, to understanding dynamics of politics. And that's a huge shift for us and a really useful way of rethinking how to understand some of the challenges we currently can deal with. I want to talk primarily about some of the learnings that we got from using the diagnostic tool. I think the first and most important was looking at using the agent, principal-agent relationship, particularly relating the minister, in our case it's a provincial minister, to the head of department, the senior public servants, and recognizing for the first time that some of the key elements of misalignment or dysfunctionality, that's probably much more accurate, had to do with the principal-agent relationship at that executive leadership level. And that the understanding that the politician has a very different kind of set of dynamics, sets of demands, set of things for their career advancement than our senior public servants, who often have a much longer scope to think about. So when we're understanding why there's some dysfunctionality, and this specifically was important because in the South African context, we had generated very powerful knowledge about improving systems, and yet the political minister, in fact, didn't really take it on and had chosen a completely different route. But that needs to be understood in the context of his political career and the ways in which his job was to signal advancement, not necessarily to take care of long-term improvement of the system. So the principal-agent relationship in that political, that relationship between politician and the civil servants is a very critical way of understanding why, despite the fact that evidence was available, it didn't really translate into substantial movement forward. The other really interesting insight came when we looked at the dimension of finance. And one of our members of our team pointed this out. It didn't emerge from the interviews, but really in the internal discussion, that in the context of finance, the issue was, in fact, that we've got a finance system that provides very limited latitude for political players or the public servant. In fact, the finance is largely driven by formula. And so that has both strengths and weaknesses. It doesn't allow for a great deal of patronage, for example, through the allocation of teaching posts to schools. It's formula driven. At the same time, there was very little flexibility to kind of prioritize teaching and learning issues. So there's a kind of complexity that we emerge from our analysis of finance. But I think that the single most important insight came from analysis of information. And it's something that is generally not part of our analyses. And we began to recognize that one of the crucial issues in the South African context is we have a very rich information system. But the information system on learning concentrates on the exit exam, system-wide that is trusted on the early grades. And so much of the system is generated or works around information, but it's really on the exit point that is the focus, and it's made on an annual basis. But when we ask the most effective district director, what do you know about learning outcomes at the early grades? She had no idea what was going on. She had very little understanding of how to use information at the earlier points. So in many respects, the framework was very useful in kind of revealing new and important dynamics that weren't fully understood in the system before. How are we taking this forward? Well, we've chosen to focus at this point with the National Planning Commission because it is a space in which large questions about system renewal are taking place. But many other dynamics have kind of taken over. So we're constantly now in a state of flux because of a major challenge to our electricity grid. So I'm not sure that this is going to be prioritized in the South African context in the immediate future.
Thanks, Bram. We're at time. So let me, as a way of motivating discussion among the panelists, but based on the questions submitted from the audience, I picked out sort of 3 themes, and I'll just throw them out there and let the panelists address them as they wish. The first one to raise their hand gets to answer whichever one they want. You're allowed to answer more than one question. So let me just kind of group them into 3. One is that some of these are fairly sincere, tough, difficult messages. And if you know the story of the mice that are in a house and they're being harassed by the cat, and the cat, occasionally kills or at least hurts some of them, and the mice say, well, the solution is very simple. Just put a little collar around the cat that has a bell on it. And so we'll be able to hear when the cat is coming. And one of the mice says, yes, but who's going to put that collar on the cat? So who's going to put the collar on the cat is kind of the question. How do you get these tough messages delivered? And I think that's one question. And they're tough because they're, the people who have to take care of them are the people that are currently generating the problem, in a sense. Maybe they don't see the problem. That the whole issue around loneliness and process compliance, for example, maybe they just don't see it. So that's one, is how do you deliver these tough messages and get action taken? The second is somebody had a really interesting question that kind of almost doing a randomized controlled trial around these things. Given that you're fairly well-informed people, would you have been able to do this without the benefit of the tool? So you imagine a world in which you didn't have the tool, but you were just as senior and perceptive as you are, would you have been able to do it? You may want to flip that, interestingly, and say, suppose that it was a very junior person doing this, but they did have access to the tool. Would that be a good thing? And thirdly, there were some questions arose around what aspects of the whole process did you find the most difficult, laborious, and so on. And that would be an interesting message for the RISE people to hear in terms of how they can make that bit of the process a little lighter or a little flexible. So raise your hands if you want to deal with one of these questions. Yeah, you can raise them either visibly or on the screen. I think Partijit was quicker, but I'm not sure. And then Bram. So let's let Partijit and then Bram and then whoever else wants to. Yeah, I see that Gautam wants to. I don't know if Linda, if you are volunteering or not, but let's go Partijit, Bram, Gautam, and then Linda. I think that's about the order in which they came up.
All right. And I think it's
take any of the 3 questions or all 3, but then if you take all 3, be super quick because we only have about 20 or so minutes, and maybe there'll be more questions. So let's leave a little flexibility here.
I'll pick the first one, Luis, and that's an interesting one. I think so short answers to that, one word answer would be the system, and that's very important. I think this, even the study in the diagnostic study asks to take the people of the system along as you're doing this almost on a voyage or a journey of discovery and all of this. I think as we realize it's a great way, and not just the quantitative way, it's a great way through discussions and focus group discussions, interviews, and also a lot of study of the policies and all of that to understand. But as you rightly said, I think, and that many times, and it's not necessarily, and when you say about the system, and you mean all stakeholders, right, who are all a part of the relationship, and people who are principal in one relationship also become agent in another relationship. I think it's critical that you take them along. And I think, yes, all the other work of making the framework, converting and demystifying the language or the lingo of the framework, making it into easy FGDs and all of that, that's the hard work you can take. But if you've taken the people along in this journey of discovery, then nothing seems like a surprise. And I think then the people who can really do about it. And I think, and that would show you that these people care. The people of the system care to know a little bit more, and they care about learning or whatever is the goal of that system. And I think we have seen this, that, at least from the very senior, the leadership of the state, that we piloted this. They were very keen to understand, and I think that gives us a lot of hope that they will, in a sense, the cat will bell itself, and take the responsibility of taking these findings and making sense of it. And that's really what you want to see, because and one of the points is particularly in a system, let's say all the way from a state which makes policies for the programs and that translate through different relationship all the way to the school. The challenge is that necessarily I don't see the results of my action. And that is what a framework like this allows. And whatever we intended, something as basic as, let's say, defining quality education, but as we have made it into policy and is understood by the school all the way through, is probably 10 different things. If we come together and try to see this in coherence, if you like, then we can jointly take that decision of taking it ahead and defining and doing something about it. So literally, if you have taken the people of the system along in this study, they will, and
Sure,
they hopefully
sure.
should take that responsibility.
Okay, I that's a very hopeful answer. I like that. The notion that maybe the cat will bell itself, and it has happened. So I don't think it's only a pious hope. I think historically it has happened, especially around the issue of process compliance, because that's kind of an easier one to swallow. And I think it is a big problem in India, this whole orientation at filling out the paperwork. Bram, you were next.
So I'll take a slightly less optimistic perspective on it. And I'm going to mix metaphors. So I'm not going to talk about cats and mice, but I'm going to talk about waves. I think that you've got to recognize that you have to wait for a moment. And there's some moments that are better than others. So in many respects, if you've got a country that's preoccupied with some things, or there's political instability, or it's dominated by one political party that's moribund, often it's not the moment of change. So you have to wait. And if you're in the sector like we have been for a while, there are moments, there are people who come along who are ready and able to really do the work that needs to be done. So we have to be ready, we need to do the research, we need to have the analytics right, we need to have the understanding, and be ready when the wave comes so that we can really move forward in that moment. Because there are moments where there isn't a possibility of change, that things have become very frozen and the interests have become locked.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Bram. Thank you for that. And that would suggest that this technique that think tanks often use of producing policy briefs on a schedule, a policy brief every 3 months, regardless of the moment, it might not be the most productive. The most productive thing might be to have, 10 policy briefs in your hard disk, and then issue them, be ready to go with 3 at the right moment, rather than 1 every 3 months. So I think that's very interesting. Thank you for that. Gautam.
Yeah. Since Partha and Bram touched upon the more optimistic and less optimistic answer to the first question, I'll try to touch on the other 2 questions. So the second question is like the senior person versus junior person, how it can differ in the approach to use the diagnostic. I think that access to the system does help in using this diagnostic framework. So if our partners have been working in the education system in these countries, that would help them kind of take this message that we are doing a diagnostic and we are trying to find the misalignments. If the system is reform oriented, we can hope that they will take this more positively rather than as a critical as a critique, right? And in terms of the laborious part of the diagnostic, I think the desk review could be very laborious. And I think that is also very useful in terms of how you plan for the whole diagnostic. So the desk review does not only mean looking at literature, that what research says about, say, role of a school principal in improving teaching and learning at the school, but looking through a lot of policy documents, government circulars, like what kind of processes are in place. And sometimes these things are not in public domain. So you really have to work within the system, them or try to look for like what kind of like processes have been defined at different levels. How are they getting translated from one level of bureaucracy to the another level of bureaucracy to the school level, right? So these, like the desk review part can become very laborious, and the more effort goes into that, I think it's the best for the whole diagnostic to design at the workshop, at the in-depth interview, and at the survey level. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, and I will start from where Gautam actually stopped. I was also thinking it's the desk review, and importantly, because this is also part of the desk review, it is designing the tool. Because in the end, and I want to say that be open, be flexible enough to know that, okay, you will have a tool designed. It may be big, but when you get to the field, be open to changing some of those things. If we realize we asked this question, but we are not getting the responses, or they are not understanding what we are asking, be open to adjusting your tool as you go ahead, not to totally change the tool, but adjust certain questions, and also adjusting your way of operation. Because when we went out to the field, we thought we would do workshops where they sit and first answer the questions and then we come and discuss. But for certain groups of people, we realized this wasn't working. So we had to engage them directly, also from understanding the questions and the desk and the tool itself. So I would say that was also laborious, but it's for a good thing, because then it helps you to design the steps going forward, and also to make sure that each element and component of your framework is covered. And then maybe just briefly to touch on question one, because the other two panelists have really touched on it well. The other thing I was thinking, that how to deliver tough message and get action, really partnerships as well along the process. There should be partnerships, because in our case, we are a policy advisory firm, but then we have people who are in advocacy. So if you bring them on, one of them was actually part of our steering committee, they get to understand these things as they go along, then they run with the findings and try to advocate for certain change. And then you also identify key actors in the framework. For the case of Uganda, I would think that if parents rose up, if communities rose up and say, no, we are tired of this end term, examinations, we are tired of this, we want only grades. We want to see a holistic child. If they raise up and they demand for some of these things, then you realize that they might be listened to, of course, taking into consideration the political factors surrounding the entire education system. Thank you.
Yeah, so that suggests, Linda, that one either wants to bring in to the whole process from the beginning, maybe, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, NGOs or others who have more of an activist kind of grassroots role, rather than merely a think tank, or at the end of the process, as part of the recommendations or something that RISE itself would want to include in the toolkit. Maybe it's already there and I just haven't read it recently. Something about how to, after the whole thing is done, how to hook up with the more activists in the society at the grassroots. Since actually, I'm so curious to know what Rafi or Dante would have had to say. I know that in theory, I was supposed to involve just the panelists, but I think especially around a couple of the questions of, how do you get messages that are maybe a little bit tough? How do you get people to listen to messages that are a bit tough, especially people that are, in a sense, the ones causing the problem? And in particular, in the case of Dante, it would be around the excessive orientation toward process compliance, and maybe the kind of optimistic point of view from Partajit that maybe when it comes to process compliance, because it's not so heavily political economy issue, maybe the cat will bell itself, people will see, versus the political economy of patronage in the case of Rafi, which might be more difficult. So if Rafi or Dante could engage with these, I think it would be fantastic. But also around the issue of, given your seniority, was the framework necessary? Or flip it around. Can you think of giving this framework to a much more junior colleague than you, and would they be able to run with it? Those would be two questions that I think if Dante or Rafi, Rafi, you're showing up ahead of Dante on my list here. So why don't you go first and then Dante?
Thank you, Luis, and thank you everyone for the great presentations. So both questions are really great. On the first question, I think in case of Balochistan, there are very strong political economy interests that sort of resist any major or fundamental change. I think one approach that we have adopted, and it seems to be making some difference, is that we need to have people who can make research-based public advocacy. The issue is and it's already gaining traction. So some of the findings I've already shared in some political public seminars, where we have shared that, look, we are spending this huge amount of scarce public resources on the construction of new schools, and the enrollment in public schools has not improved by 1 percentage point. So people know that something is not good with the education system, but they don't really know what is going wrong. So I think people who can use this tool or research-based findings, and we need more politically oriented researchers. That's a radical suggestion I would like to make. We need academics and researchers who can go political and don't shy away from participating in public and political platforms to make these statements that have political connotations. Dante, you may want to add.
Yes, Dante, go ahead.
Thank you, Rafi, and thank you, Luis, for your question. It is really, really interesting to me, that kind of idea of the political economy, of the patronage, and the idea of process of compliance. I tend to think that the idea of the compliance and to be very focused on the process has to be with the idea of how we avoid that kind of clientelism. It's in a way, I tend to think that it's a kind of a reaction of, being kind of away of that kind of processes in which, political parties, ideologies tend to play a role. So when when the system, goes toward that kind of, process, rational, Bavarian state of being, you see what I mean? So being so rational in terms of the process, because that is the way in which we are going to, to get the results, or what the system is expecting. Probably we tend to be in that kind of trap of filling forms, paperwork, and all of that, and we tend to lose sight of of the kind of the final the final goals in learning improvement. So to me that is one thing, and the other one, I think for us, as we address the issue of kind of different positions, people that very engaged with the policy making, we say, okay, we are trying to put in practice a different framework. It's a different type of conversation. It's not to blame that or make responsible that person. It is a kind of a system way of thinking where it's more than the actors or the responsibility of any specific actors. That was the way in which we addressed that issue.
I think that's great. And what you said touches, I forget which of the other, I think it was either someone from India or Pakistan that brought up the issue of excessive process compliance being a reaction to corruption and patronage. And then you get caught in this thing. But I want to come back to that when I think I'm supposed to say a couple of closing things, because I think there's a key to this perhaps in some of the work that RISE is doing. But I think maybe one of you had their hand. Oh yeah, Bram, is that an old hand or a new hand?
No, that's a new. It's responding to his conversation about.
Sorry. So
how do you make
Bram, go ahead, and I think Partajit also had his hand up. So Bram, go ahead.
So I want to just respond to this. I mean, it's one of the big questions in the room is about how do you use this tool as a vehicle for improvement, and I think what's crucial is you've got to address this issue tactically as well as strategically. But let me be specific. If you think about a change as a process that takes place at multiple sites. You've got to identify where you're most likely to hear have a sympathetic hearing. So, you know, if the site is fraught with politics, then it's not going to be very responsive to very critical points. So in our case, there's a site that's beginning to emerge, which is the National Planning Commission, and there's a debate about cadre deployment and the weaknesses of the public service. It's a site where they're looking for evidence to use to push a particular agenda, and it's not specifically in education, it's across the entire public service, and they want to kind of think about changing the relationship between politicians and senior public managers, and so ours sits very neatly in that space. How far it'll go, there's still lots of questions about it, but we recognize that even though it could actually work in many different ways, that's the space which is most likely to get a real hearing.
Okay. Guys, be really quick because we have to wrap up, but I think Partijit and then Gautam have their hands up, but be super quick, like 30 seconds or so.
Sure, Luis. I think so. You know, just one, and there was a question about, you know, has it been done? So fortunately, we were able to share this in a low stakes environment, and that's the point I was making, with everybody together. And so that's the beauty of that was, right? All the principals, agents, and everybody,
right,
only except the parents were not in the room. So I think that's the beauty. And in a low stakes environment of sharing the findings, there were greater acceptability, which gives us hope. So that's just a procedural answer to how do we go about sharing this.
Great. Thank you. Gautam?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight one small thing. So while we were talking about broader policy implications and all, but like in our experience, this diagnostic really helps at like a more micro level as well, like in terms of program design. So if we are working with education officers and their role is to visit schools and help support teachers, principals in improving teaching and learning, but we see there are no like resources allocated to them to make those visits, right? To kind of at least highlight that kind of misalignment at the local bureaucracy level, and say that like if you don't give them resources to visit the schools, how will they like make these changes happen? So these this diagnostic can also help us like expose such small misalignment like at a more like micro level rather than a larger policy level. So that's also really important in improving any program design.
Okay, thanks. Let me before turning it over to Yue-Yi for the kind of the formal closing, let me maybe drive home a couple of conclusions that I've taken away from these things, from this interaction, and I'll just say maybe 3 themes that I think we can take away. One is from Rafi, from Linda, the whole issue of evidence-based policy advocacy and public advocacy that is based on evidence, because that's clear, but it's not just evidence, it also has to be advocacy, because evidence doesn't necessarily have a demand side, whereas advocacy can create the demand side and the public preoccupation with the issues, the grassroots, the advocacy, but it has to be evidence-based. That's kind of one takeaway. The second takeaway comes a little bit more from Bram and I think Partijit and so on, is where and when, timing, you know, being ready at the right time when the situation demands it, rather than thinking that the whole world is waiting for the pronouncements of us as supreme analysts that politicians are going to pay attention to. No, they pay attention when it's convenient, when the time is right, and when the place is right. I think Partijit and Gautam also made that point. Sometimes it might happen at a lower level. The place may be a lower level, and we may have a smaller impact, but a more real impact. Sometimes the time is right, as I think Bram said. I think a kind of wraparound point that links to other issues in RISE is that around this issue, for example, of the possible conflict between patronage and process compliance becomes a burdensome way to deal with patronage. I think part of the key to this might be to link to another theme of RISE, which is the purpose of education. if the society thinks that the purpose of education is to comply with the SDGs or the MDGs, but few people, including the politicians, the people themselves, don't understand the fundamental value of education in a process of creating the nation, in a true process of nation building, then you can play these games. You can either be a patronage or you can hide in process compliance. I think the way to maybe beat this contradiction between process compliance and patronage is to fundamentally understand if the politicians and the people really understand that we're not playing games here, that education really is existential. So maybe I'll leave that with that hopeful message and that hook to other RISE themes. So Yue-Yi, you're free to close.
Wonderful. Luis, I'm thankful for that summary because the panelists' reflections were also rich that my thoughts are all over the place right now. But thank you everyone so much. Thank you, Dante. Thank you, Rafi and Linda and Gautam and Bram. And oh my goodness, I'm missing someone. I'm so sorry. But thank you, everyone. Thank you also to the audience for the wonderfully thoughtful questions and comments in the audience. Partha, thank you, Partha. Sorry about that. Just two super quick things as we close. So again, the RISE Education Systems Diagnostic Toolkit is available online. It's open access, so please feel free to share and adapt it far and wide. And next slide, please, just looking ahead. So RISE is a research program. Our sunset is going to come at the end of March. So please save the date for our final webinar, which will be on Tuesday, the 28th of February. At that webinar, Lant Pritchett, who's our research director, is going to be sharing about what he considers to be some of the most important research findings to emerge from the RISE program. So if you'd like to receive registration details, and those are available, please sign up to our mailing list. Again, thank you so much and have a lovely day, everyone. Appreciate your being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.